Our search for the truth about Jesus took us away from the safety of Jerusalem into modern-day Bethlehem. Though at times the area is politically unstable and sometimes war-torn, its inhabitants are of humble origins, much like Joseph and Mary were 2,000 years ago. We've come to the Church of the Nativity. This is the traditional birthplace of Jesus. Some scholars claim that Jesus wasn't really born here. We wanted to get a second opinion. Others even claim that Matthew tells us Jesus was born in Bethlehem, while Luke implies he was born in Nazareth. Who is right? Well, in the Gospel of Matthew, we are told, Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king. Then in the Gospel of Luke we read, and Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. And it came about that while they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. It seems both Matthew and Luke clearly state Jesus was born in Bethlehem.
I think he was born in Bethlehem. In fact, again, let's take the alternative. What evidence is there that he was born in Nazareth? And my response would be silence. There is none.
One scholar who disagrees is Marcus Borg, the founder of the Jesus Seminar. He thinks Jesus was born in Nazareth, since he is called Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels.
Well, I think that that's pretty much a silly observation. The fact that Jesus was called Jesus of Nazareth tells us less about where he was born than about where he came from as a young adult when he started his ministry. It tells us that he was known as Jesus of Nazareth because that's where he lived during his adolescence. It doesn't tell us where he was born. He was born in Bethlehem.
Now, it's true that in order to tell the whole story of Christmas, it's necessary to put the two accounts together. Matthew and Luke each present information about what happened. But because they supply additional facts that are different, should we conclude with the critics that they have given us two contradictory reports?
Well, the key combination is the idea different equals contradictory. And that's not the only way to look at it. You can have different accounts of the same event, and they can have differences in them and not be contradictory at all. I often joke with my kids that if you listen to my wife and I tell a story about the same event, we're not going to pick the same details. Now, some of it will overlap, and some of it will be different. And part of what she tells you is going to be part of the story, and part of what I tell you is going to be part of the story, too. And actually, there's great value in having those different accounts because they each penetrate the story at a different angle. And in that difference of penetration, you get more insight into the character and into the event. And it's not contradictory at all.
Now, Peter Jennings stated that much of the information we have from this part of the world does not support either Matthew or Luke's account of Jesus' birth. Claire Fung is an expert on Jewish birth practices and the culture of Bethlehem during the time of Jesus. We asked her if she agreed with the critical scholars who say that the account of Jesus' birth in early years presents a false picture of first-century Jewish life.
I don't agree. I don't think that the Gospels present a false picture of Jewish life in the first century in the Holy Land. I think, if anything, Luke in particular endeavors to show us the norms of Jewish life.
Luke presents both John the Baptist and Jesus as children who are circumcised on the 8th day in fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Mary and Joseph are pictured as observant, pious Jews who bring Jesus up according to the law of Moses, present him in the temple. Luke also tells us that as a family, they went up to the great pilgrimage feast in Jerusalem, such as the time of Passover.
And later in Jesus' life, it's reiterated time and again that it was his practice to go to the synagogue on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, and that he was pious and observant of Jewish traditions. I think that we see an enormous amount of material that authentically reflects Jewish life in the first century in the Holy Land, in the Gospels.
We also talked to respected Jewish archaeologist Dr. Megan Broshi and asked if he thinks information from this part of the world supports what the Gospel writers say.
On certain things, they fit very well of what we know about the first century Palestine. They fit very well because they give us a good picture of what was happening here, and archaeology can prove it.
Now, archaeology doesn't prove that Jesus was really God's son. Source critical work and all that stuff doesn't prove those things. But what it does is it shows that there is a historical foundation on which confessions of faith, or against, in the light of which confessions of faith make perfectly good sense.
Now, some scholars assert that the accounts of Jesus' virgin birth in the Gospels are similar to Greek and Roman mythologies. They point to the myth told about Caesar Augustus, in which his mother was made pregnant by the Greek and Roman sun god Apollo. Well, what about this?
Let's take a mystery religion pattern or Hellenistic religion, a Hellenistic divine man pattern. These characters are not historical persons. They've never lived in history. So what's the grounds for comparison? And I love the words of Plutarch, who in his famous story of Isis and Osiris, he says, now listen, don't you guys think that this is an historical account? I'm telling you a story here. And he says that twice. So I think that's important, that there's a contrast.
I think when I compare the virgin birth and its simplicity, God comes to Mary and says, you're going to have a child, and basically does it. And there are no, to use the Jennings example, there are no snakes that have to appear in the night to impregnate the woman. It's just done by the verbal command. See, it's the simplicity of the way in which the miraculous is displayed in the Bible.
Matthew and Luke both, I'm sure, knew that out there in the wider pagan world, there were people who told stories about Alexander the Great being conceived when his mother was a virgin, about Augustus, similarly, about various heroes and demigods. And since Matthew and Luke both want to talk about Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism, which didn't have stories like that, this is really kind of a dangerous ground for them to be getting into. And so I ask myself as a historian, why would they do that? Particularly when the obvious sneering retort to such a report is, oh, well, we know Mary was just sleeping around with Roman soldiers or whatever, which is precisely what some of the enemies of Christianity went on to say. So it seems to me that Matthew and Luke would not have included those stories unless they really believed that something very strange like this had happened.
While questioning the accuracy of the gospel writers, Peter Jennings implied Luke's account of the birth of Jesus could not be historical, since the question remained, why would Joseph ever bring Mary on such a difficult journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem through the desert, especially when she was very, very pregnant?
Well, there are just so many things wrong with that question, aren't there? Starting off, of course, with the fact that maybe she wasn't very, very pregnant at the time that they made the journeys. We pointed out in Luke chapter 2, it doesn't say that she was in labor when she was traveling to Bethlehem. It says while she was in Bethlehem, she went into labor. The time came for her to be delivered, number one. Number two, it's not that dangerous of a journey to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And we see that probably the practice was to travel in groups of people. It would be a 3 or 4 day journey. They would camp out under the stars. They would bring food with them. And there were not bandits on every side waiting to attack every traveler. So I think that we find a few basic presuppositions that are just our own modern skepticism and really don't deal with the reality of the fact that if Joseph and Mary had come to live together as a married couple at this point, why on earth would he leave her at home when he faced a prolonged absence, waiting for the census to be accomplished?
The big question for many people is, can we accept the miracle of the virgin birth?
Now, of course, I cannot prove the virginal conception of Jesus, and I don't think you can prove it in the same way as I would prove the resurrection, that you can't explain the rise of early Christianity without it. That forces me to hold my modern mind open to say, if God was really in Christ reconciling the world to himself, ought I not to expect some other strange things as well? And when I then have these stories which look so strange, and yet, why would they do that? Maybe it really did happen. Because you see, as far as I know, nobody in Judaism was going around saying, aha, Isaiah 7:14, Messiah must be born of a virgin. I don't know that anyone was taking that text like that before. So it's not that Matthew had that text in mind and had to pin it on Jesus. I suspect that Matthew would have been quite happy not to mention that, but it's rather the case that he's got this